Long before borders were drawn on maps, long before oceans were crossed in the name of conquest or salvation, there existed societies across the American continents that understood something modern civilization still struggles to name. These societies did not treat sex as entertainment, nor as shame, nor even primarily as romance. They treated it as architecture, a force that built families, organized power, stabilized communities, and quietly decided who would lead and who would disappear into history. And at the center of this architecture stood women, not as symbols, not as possessions, but as managers of consequence. In much of ancient North and Central America, sex was never isolated from life. It was not hidden behind closed doors or split away from politics and spirituality. Instead, it was woven into everything that mattered: lineage, inheritance, land ownership, ritual authority, and collective survival. To understand these societies, one must abandon the modern idea that sexuality is a private indulgence. For them, intimacy was public in its impact, even when practiced privately. A single sexual bond could alter alliances, shift power between clans, and determine the future of entire bloodlines. Women were the primary navigators of this system, not because they were romanticized, but because biology placed them at the crossroads of continuity. They knew whose child belonged to which lineage, which unions strengthened the community, and which ones introduced instability. This knowledge was not casual. It was trained, taught, and guarded. Girls learned early that desire without structure was dangerous, not immoral, dangerous, because chaos in reproduction meant chaos in inheritance, and chaos in inheritance meant violence. Unlike later European societies that moralized sex through guilt and sin, many indigenous American cultures regulated sex through responsibility. The question was never, "Is this wrong?" but "What does this produce?" Every intimate act was measured not by purity, but by outcome. Would this bond strengthen kinship networks? Would it clarify or confuse lineage? Would it stabilize or fracture the social order? In matrilineal societies, which were more common than modern history admits, descent passed through the mother. Property, clan membership, and even political legitimacy followed the female line. This made women the living archives of society. Men might hold visible leadership roles, but women controlled continuity. A chief without maternal backing was powerless. A warrior without lineage recognition was irrelevant. Sex, therefore, was not about male dominance or female submission. It was about who controlled the story of origin. This is where Europe would later feel threatened, not because indigenous societies were sexually free, but because they were sexually competent. They had systems that worked without churches, without written contracts, without centralized states. Sexual order was maintained through ritual, education, and communal memory. Women knew when to permit intimacy, when to delay it, when to redirect it, and when to sever it entirely. Rituals surrounding menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth were not sources of shame, but of authority. Menstruating women were often considered powerful, not polluted. Their cycles were tracked, respected, and sometimes isolated not as punishment, but as recognition of their liminal status, existing between creation and destruction. This frightened European observers who arrived with doctrines that framed female biology as dangerous or sinful. What they saw was not debauchery, but autonomy. And autonomy is always unsettling to systems built on obedience. Marriage, in these societies, was not a romantic fantasy. It was a strategic arrangement that balanced emotional bonds with communal needs. Love could exist, but it was not allowed to override stability. Women often had significant say in choosing partners, dissolving unions, or restructuring households. Divorce, where it existed, carried far less stigma than in Europe because it was understood that forcing incompatible bonds endangered everyone.
Sex education was not avoided, it was contextualized. Young people learned about intimacy not through secrecy, but through story, observation, and mentorship. Elders, often women, explained not only how sex worked, but why it mattered. Desire was acknowledged as natural, but unregulated desire was treated like fire, useful, necessary, and capable of destruction if mishandled. Europe, at the same time, was moving in the opposite direction. As Christianity tightened its grip on social order, sex became a battlefield of control. Female sexuality, in particular, was reframed as a threat to male authority and divine hierarchy. Knowledge that once circulated freely among midwives and matriarchs was criminalized. Women who understood reproduction too well became suspicious figures. Power shifted away from communal regulation toward institutional enforcement. When European explorers encountered indigenous American societies, they misread what they saw. They mistook order for looseness, ritual for promiscuity, and autonomy for moral collapse. They could not comprehend a system where women were not owned, where sex was not sinful, and where authority did not flow exclusively through male lineage. The fear was not of nakedness or rituals, it was of a functioning alternative. This fear hardened into policy. Colonial administrations targeted indigenous sexual systems deliberately. Missionaries condemned rituals. Matrilineal inheritance was dismantled. European marriage laws were imposed. Women who once held authority over lineage were pushed into domestic dependency. Sex was stripped of its communal logic and reframed as private sin. But knowledge does not vanish easily. It survives in fragments, in stories whispered between generations, in ceremonies performed quietly, in instincts passed from mother to daughter. Even today, echoes of this ancient understanding challenge modern assumptions. They remind us that sexuality was once a language of order, not rebellion, of responsibility, not shame. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: Europe did not fear indigenous American sexuality because it was uncontrolled. It feared it because it was controlled without Europe. When Europe finally encountered the ancient societies of the Americas, it did not discover sexual chaos or moral absence, but a deeply functional system of intimacy that operated without fear, shame, or institutional permission. A system in which indigenous American women understood sexuality not as temptation or rebellion, but as a force that required discipline, timing, and social intelligence. And this understanding unsettled the civilization that had already transformed the human body into a site of guilt and obedience, because these women carried generational knowledge about desire, reproduction, and consequence without needing priests, written law, or divine threat to validate it, knowing that sex was never merely personal pleasure, but a mechanism that quietly shaped lineage, inheritance, communal stability, and political continuity, which is why intimacy was taught openly through ritual, story, and observation, rather than buried beneath silence, and why women were trusted as custodians of sexual order rather than framed as moral risks. Yet to European eyes, trained to equate control with virtue, this clarity appeared dangerous, autonomy looked like immorality, and balance resembled disorder, prompting colonial power to respond by dismantling matrilineal systems, criminalizing communal sexual knowledge, replacing female authority with male-dominated institutions, and reframing responsibility as sin, not to protect society, but to centralize control. Because a population that understands its own body cannot be ruled through shame, and a society that integrates sexuality into its communal logic does not require constant surveillance or fear. Sex was therefore privatized, stripped of meaning, and pushed into silence, producing not purity but confusion, not order but fragmentation, a legacy that still echoes in modern cultures saturated with sexual imagery, yet starved of understanding, where desire is loud but wisdom is thin, and intimacy feels disconnected from purpose.
And in this silence lies the forgotten truth ancient American women once lived by, that sex without wisdom creates chaos, but sex without hierarchy creates fear. And what Europe truly feared was never indigenous sexuality itself, but the possibility that intimacy could exist without punishment, without permission, and without control, guided instead by clarity passed quietly from woman to woman across generations, revealing that the most dangerous knowledge is not rebellion, but understanding. And perhaps the greatest loss was not that this wisdom was destroyed, but that the modern world forgot how stable, grounded, and human intimacy feels when it is governed by comprehension rather than fear.